don't know, like 16 ounces maybe? Somewhere in there. Okay, so I'll teach you a little bit of how the sausage is made. So we've been pretty far behind in our classes, and it's been all right. So we get like I have like right here, front and back, and a third page of notes every week, and we get like this much off of the first page. And so that leaves us a considerable amount, but during the week, usually on a Wednesday, I'll spend the time to prep the next class. What ends up happening is we get through the notes that I wrote 2 weeks before, and then get through the first point of the next week. So last time we ended exactly with the previous week's class. So I wrote this for last week, and we didn't even get to the first point. So I said, okay, this will be perfect. I invested my time in other places last week, didn't make a class, and then we get here, and I have 10 extra minutes tonight. So we might go past what I even have prepared. So that will be fun if we get to do that. You can see if I'm a good impromptu teacher, that or I'll give you free time. We'll see, whichever one. But so we've been studying Exodus. This is we started I think the second to last Sunday in July was Exodus. And we were going to continue on until the very last Sunday in September. But today we start in chapter 16. And it's a little different now because for the first time since the end of Genesis, minus a little excursion from Moses, we're not in Egypt anymore. We're on the other side of the Red Sea. The setting of the story has changed. But that doesn't mean the story's over. And I'll probably hit on this. You'll hear this comment again in a couple weeks. But, it'd be very interesting. It's interesting to me that movies end here. They don't really make it much farther past the Red Sea. You get to the other side and then roll credits with the song. But this is only half of the book. It's not even half of the book, actually. Come to think of it, I believe there's 40 chapters. Yep, 40 chapters. It's not even half the book. And it's important that we don't neglect the second half of Exodus. There is still a ton of good quality material to be had on the other side of the Red Sea. And so over the next 3 chapters, which I'm hoping to cover tonight, 16, 17, and 18, we see God's testing of his people. The testing that is had of Israel between deliverance and covenant, between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai. Okay, there's testing to be had along the way. And that's what we're going to dive into tonight. Can I get somebody to read me 15, verses 22 through the end? And so, yeah, technically there's a story. Sometimes, I don't think I'm an arrogant person. But sometimes I have real beef with the people who made the verses and chapters. Why didn't you just end chapter 15 with the end of Miriam's song and then start 16 with the trials that fit so well together? I don't know why they left this on the other side of chapter 16. But don't get me started on Mark chapter 3. That's something else. But hey, who can read for me 15, 22 through the end?
22 through what?
The end.
Of Exodus?
Yes, 15. I actually got Marissa. Yes. Thank you, Marissa.
15, 22 to 20.
Yes, 7.
Okay. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water.
Thank you. Yeah, so they've crossed through the Red Sea, like we mentioned. They've been delivered. They've been freed from their slavery. They see their oppressors lying dead on the shores. And now they start out on their journey, and there's more trials. You would think that if you just come out of this slavery and God has come and He saved you and He's rescued you in this dramatic fashion, you would think, oh man, it's finally going to be, bliss and good things. And nope, right after the songs of praise, you're presented with a test, a trial, a frustration, and they start to grumble. And on one hand, I understand that, because what were they promised? One of the things that we pointed out earlier that was important to the story was that God doesn't just call us out of a hard time, and that's the end. He calls us out of a hard time and into His goodness. And so with the promises of deliverance in chapters 4 and 3 and later on, there's also a promise of being put into a land flowing with milk and honey. And here they are, and there's not milk and honey, there's not even drinkable water. Okay? And so they have this expectation, but there's a journey to get to that expectation. We've talked a little bit about this term that I'm very fond of, already not yet. Right? That they were already rescued, they'd already been delivered, but they had not yet reached that fullness of God's deliverance, that there were still frustrations and pains to be had along the way. And I think we see that in the Christian life as well. We have Christ who has come and has died as an atonement for our sins, and we have forgiveness of sins now. We have the Holy Spirit. We have all this goodness available to us now. That is the already. And yet we look out into a broken world and see pain and suffering and death, and then we ask questions. Say, God, I thought you had promised us so much better. Well, that's the not yet. We live in this in-between time where we have the gifts of God. They've been inaugurated into our world. But we look forward to the final consummation and final full realization of all that good that we believe comes in the next life, if you will. Yeah.
Verse 26.
26.
If they had followed that from the very beginning, the trip would have been between 2 and 3 weeks to get there.
Oh, you think so? Yep. It would have made their whole lives a lot better from the get-go, right?
You see, that's something I don't understand, but it goes on today.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you have. Let's look at verse 26. I'll reread this. This is after they've turned the water from bitterness to drinkable water. God says, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in His eyes, if you pay attention to His commands and keep all of His decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Yeah, and this is interesting. In the very first test on the other side of the Red Sea, that it's not just a test, it's not just another demonstration of God's ability to provide for them, which it is, those things. But God here, right off the bat, ties together obedience with, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well-being. Not goodwill, I was going to say goodwill. Well-being. That there is a relationship between obedience and well-being. Now, it's important for us to remember, and I feel like I have to throw out this caveat all the time, we don't want to turn this into a prosperity gospel. It's like, hey, obey God, and everything will be all right. Obey God, and you won't have suffering. Obey God, and you'll have everything you want. No, it's not that. But as I tried to iterate this morning, if we do obey the ways of God, who has our best interest at heart, things will be better off. Right? And that's kind of what we see here. And for Israel, He wanted them to know this from the very get-go. It's interesting, though, there's not really been any direct decrees or commands or laws given to them yet, right? They haven't gotten to Sinai. There's no 2 stone tablets. So when God says, hey, listen to my commands and you'll be okay, the Israelites are probably sitting there going, oh, what commandments? What are you talking about? And there's some different opinions on that. I kind of personally lean to the idea that it was just God kind of putting the first foot forward to say, hey, you're going to be getting some commands. And as you get them, whether a bunch at the mountain or through Moses here and there, I want you to obey them now. There's actually some rabbinical thought in the Jewish traditions that think that here at Mara, or whether they give it a new name, or is it just called Mara? That God gave them a few specific commandments, including the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is actually talked about in the next chapter before they get to Mount Sinai, before the Ten Commandments come. I'm not opposed to that idea, but that's a lot of content that's not in the Bible. And so I tend to lean towards this was just a preparatory comment. Hey, as I give commands through Moses, before you get to the covenant, prepare yourself to follow me, to live a better life. For I am the God who heals you. I want healing for you. I healed this water for the healing of your body, and I can heal you too.
So we shouldn't lose sight of some context here in that they don't actually have much of a relationship with God. They don't understand who he is, what he's all about. I mean, they've heard a few things at this point.
Right.
They got 40 years to learn it, but there's an element here of God starting to teach them who he is in relationship to them, because in their natural state they're going to say, well, this is the God who killed all those Egyptians.
Yeah.
And he could do the same to us. They don't feel that specialness yet.
That's a good point.
And so that's part of the reason that they took as long as they did getting to where they were going. Because if they just showed up in the land of milk and honey, it would have been all about the milk and honey.
Yeah.
And God would have been back there somewhere. So he needed time, and he needed lots of directive teaching like this to let him know who he was. Not the wrathful God, but the loving God who's going to take care of them as a nation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we're going to see that. That's a huge point here for the next couple of chapters. You know, I did that sermon, like two-part sermons, a couple months ago on wilderness. And I specifically used this text right here, if you remember. And, you know, the main idea to this is the idea of testing. That it's not temptation from God, but there is. God allows for a testing of our faith so that we can rely on him harder. And I'm not going to reiterate that whole sermon. Hopefully, you know, some of that's still in your mind. But, you know, there's an idea here that through this, they are being tested. And God's okay with them being tested, because it's going to allow them to learn and know of God a little bit better through it.
What's the purpose of the test?
Right.
It teaches us, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The test tells us what we need to learn. God was telling his people, there's things you need to learn.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be easy.
Mm-hmm.
I've read this Bible over and over, and I've never found a passage that said it's going to be easy.
Oh, no. You can find some that say the exact opposite.
And Jesus told his disciples, they hated me, they'll hate you.
Yeah.
So this is an example of a learning process, and they have a lot to learn.
Exactly.
So do we.
Yeah, I don't want us to have the concept that a test is there to make us fail. That God wants us, sometimes you might have that extra harsh teacher in your background that you felt like, oh, they're just doing this because they want to see me flop. That's not what it's probably not what your teacher was doing. But that's definitely not what God is doing here either, right? God is doing this so that we can have a better understanding of him. Whether we do really well in this test or whether we have a hard time with this test, we will come out the other side of the wilderness experience knowing that God is able to provide and will see us through it and will be there on the other side.
I'm kind of thinking of the beginning of God's relationship with the Israelites as the honeymoon phase.
Yeah.
They're about to have 40 years of alone time with God.
Yeah.
And in that alone time, they're going to experience the hardships that enrich the joy, kind of like you talked about this morning.
Mm-hmm.
That creates a deeper appreciation for who God is. It's not Grandpa's deep pockets, but it's somebody who you go to with hard times that you celebrate the good times with, and yeah, it's kind of like the honeymoon phase.
Yep.
40 years of alone time to learn.
Right. Yeah, and I like that analogy because, how do we depthen the relationship in a marriage and the love and the commitment there? Through going through good times and bad times. Maybe if it was all bad times, it might not be there. But if it was all good times too, that wouldn't be a strong faith. I like to use tree analogies, right? If you can't grow, or you talk about a tree that's isolated and protected by walls on all four sides, the roots of that tree are going to be very shallow. And if you took away those walls and let the full gust of the wind come and hit that tree, it's going to fall right over. But a tree that grows up in a solitary field and faces the winds on a regular basis and the storms on a regular basis forces itself to grow roots that go well down deep so that it can face all those trials and tests, right? And so the marriage thing is, I think, the same way. When we go through in life as a married, committed couple, we grow closer through some of those hard times, don't we? If it's all honeymoon phase, it can be very superficial. And the same thing is happening with God and Israel. I appreciate that, Shay. In fact, one of the this is a third metaphor in this one comment, but another one I have here is Israel's in adolescence, and God is working to mature them, which might risk some defiance. So as a parent, you can do husband and wife thing. You can do a parent to a son thing. You can do a tree thing. Those are all biblical metaphors too, by the way. And so to kind of cap that off, difficult circumstances in life provide the people of God with greater opportunities to trust in and experience God's power. And that's what we've been saying here for the last couple of minutes. Difficult circumstances in life for God's people allow us to experience and trust in the power of God more deeply. And we got to remember that. It's hard to remember that in the difficult times. It's an easy thing to teach. It's a hard thing to live and experience.
Maybe there's something to be said also for this word bitter.
Yeah.
Bitter, because the trials of life, if we don't respond to them right, can make us resentful and bitter.
Turn us bitter.
And the Hebrews 12 warns about that bitter root that can develop in your heart, because a bitter root develops and grows. It gets tied into your heart. It's very hard to erase.
Yeah.
And one of the key traits of God is His goodness. And He's showing them His goodness here. If there's ever a hint of doubt in our heart about God being good, we're vulnerable to sin. And He didn't want them to be bitter like that. He said, I'm good 100%, I'm good all the way.
Yeah.
Don't develop bitterness against me. And I think there might be some symbolism here.
I think that's good. Yeah, the idea of their grumbling and their discontent, especially as they're about to enter into more wilderness for the next few chapters, showing them how I heal bitterness. Don't allow yourself to become Mara, the bitter one. Which I really appreciate that. My thought, we preached on Ruth a couple weeks ago, her wanting to go by Mara, because she had that bitterness. Even she attributes a lot of her pain to God. It's very Job-esque.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, this is all really good. I think it's interesting to see that the grumbling is kind of a staple for Israel, especially us 21st century Christians. We just like to know Israel by the grumbling. I mean, it's just kind of the thing you learn in Sunday school growing up. But it's interesting to me that there's a lot of continuity between pre-Sinai Israel and post-Sinai Israel. And just some thoughts on, don't we still have some continuity before and after baptism too? We like to think, this was Israel before they met God on the mountain, before the Ten Commandments came, before they committed and saw that power. Not that obviously they've seen it already, but they haven't entered into that covenant yet. No one's entered into the covenant, they're going to stop their grumbling. They're going to be a much more obedient and faithful people, and they're not. The tendencies they had at first, they still have. And us as humans, we strive to be better after baptism, after we've entered into that covenant. And we should, along this journey, be growing. And I've embraced that more now than I did when I was younger, this idea of sanctification, that we should be better Christians further on down the journey. But there will still be continuity before the water's baptism and after the water's baptism on our own fallen state. The difference is, in covenant, God washes us clean, and I think that's a nice little comparison here as well. I saw yes. Go ahead.
You mentioned the concept of a test, and one of the things that I see Rachel taking tests at college all the time, and a test can either give you confidence that I got it right, that I understand the material, or it can make you realize that you don't and you need to study more. And it can also give you that confidence that if I study more, I'm going to get it. And I think that's God's call too.
Yeah.
Study my word, come to me, rely on me, and be confident that I'm here to catch you.
Yeah, every time that things seem like they're falling apart, when God shows up, the next time it feels like things are falling apart, I'm going to be able to rely on God a little bit better, earlier, quicker, more faithfully. Yeah, I think
that's
so.
What He's trying to do with that test too, not just to test them, but to give them confidence that He's there and that they're getting closer to Him.
And develop that. And I think that's great. I think that's a key thing here. It's actually reminded me back, to complement that, is a thought that I think it was Jared Culbertson brought up last week about how if they weren't as afraid before the Red Sea, would they have appreciated it as much? And I was like, huh. I don't know, that's an interesting point, that a lot of the praise and the appreciation and the thanksgiving and the awe comes out of the fear. And if they had been perfectly faithful, they could have been standing like, oh, it's the Egyptian army, and God's going to save us, not a problem. And sometimes I wonder, not that we should be fearful or doubting or anything like that, but I think that was a good point to fit alongside this, that, hey, God's testing us and growing us and making us more faithful, more trusting, more confident in Him, in His power. But also, when we have the fear, like, let's at least use that to turn praise back to God. And I think those ideas fit well together. Andy?
Yeah, I was just going to add one more element to the bitterness conversation.
Yeah.
Is that when you establish the Passover memorial, it includes bitter herbs. So that's going to be part of their culture going forward. That
The
they're
bitter
always
herbs.
going to be remembering through the bitter herbs.
Right.
This whole process that they're going through.
And they do, and they continue the bitter herbs all the way through. What do bitter herbs stand for? The sin. It's the sin. Playing is the sin. Do you remember? As long as someone I know who grew up doing Seder dinners every year. You don't remember? I'll tell you that. Okay. I think it's sin. And I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't know. I think God was pretty. What's the word I want to use here? It's hard to use words when you're talking about God and how He feels. I think God was not pleased at the methods that had to happen for the freeing of Israel. The deaths of all the firstborn sons. I can't help but think maybe some of that bitterness was to remember that. In fact, that's in there. 13. The consecration of the firstborns in 13. It talks about doing it to remember not just the sons that I've saved, you as my firstborn son, as Israel's called through Exodus, but he says, I want you to remember the sons that were lost for you. And
life has got a lot of bitterness.
Life has got a lot of bitterness. Yeah, I appreciate
and
that.
that's part of the relationship with them.
Yeah. This is good. So a lot of this okay, we've spent 40 minutes on this first 5 verses. But I will say, a lot of this applies to the next 4 stories. Okay, the conversations we're having about testing, about seeing and embracing God and growing in God and grumbling, all of this applies to the next 4 stories. They're not like, oh, we can toss out the next 3 stories because this is just a repetition. That's not the case. There's new and good content and ability to learn, be edified, and grow through these. But they're on the same theme. They're following the same trail, and they're emphasizing similar points through that. So the next one is the manna and the quail. It's a little bit of a longer reading. Can I get somebody to read 16? And then trying to find a sizable chunk that highlights the whole text. Yeah, I want somebody to do 11 through 26. If I get somebody to do 11 through 26.
I'll try it, brother.
Thank you, Gary.
This is 26, go down there.
Yeah, 16, 11 through 26.
Right, yeah, correct. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came up at the evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. Then the children of Israel did so, and gathered, some more, some less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's need. And Moses said, let no one leave any of it till morning. Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses. But some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. and Moses was angry with them. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need. And when the sun became hot, it melted. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." So they laid it up until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink, nor was there any worms in it, nor were there. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none."
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, so kind of diving into this next test, they don't have this food and sustenance they're looking for. But, to kind of go back on and kind of add to the tisking at the Israelites, it does seem like the longing for their desires or outweigh the joy of living in God's liberated life for them, okay? That they have these desires for meat and for more sustenance and food, and they're letting that outdo the joy that they have being free and living with God. Chokes it out, the anxieties choke it out a little bit. And I say that, more this time because we're told that the Israelites left Egypt with a great amount of herds, right? I forget about that. I found that in one of my studies that, they left Egypt with great herds, so fear of starvation was probably a bit uncalled for. They weren't going very far. Moses had made the trip a couple times, so the idea that they left with great herds and were going just to Mount Sinai, they probably weren't going to starve to death. That was a kind of an uncalled for fear, and they were letting these anxieties or these desires, whatever it might be, choke out just the joy of being free and being with God. I try to scale back a lot of my, we shouldn't be as hard on the grumblings of Israel a lot of the times. This time I'm like, no, it's okay. We can be a little hard on them for grumbling at this point. But we still see that God provides for them. He provides for them with this manna, as we call it, and the quail, this daily bread, if you will. And that's what's so important about this, is the idea that it is daily bread, that it is something God provides for them every single day, and every day alone, minus the 6th day or the 7th, that they go to bed each night knowing they don't have any food for tomorrow. They have to trust and rely on God's provision for food the next day, except for the 6th day, which they knew they'd have it for Saturday, or the Sabbath, but that was it. That even if they tried to hoard it for themselves and collect it and keep it for the next day, when they woke up, it was maggots and moldy and stank. By the way, I think stank is used more. It's got to be used more in Exodus than anywhere else. I'm going to look that up later because I caught me. I think Gary has had to read every time it says stank in his book. Anyway, so I think that's so important. We don't have. Somebody can correct me, or I'd love an example, but we're not forced into that anymore. God doesn't force us into that. There's very little in our lives that God is saying, hey, you have to rely on me for this. There's a lot of internal things, spiritual things, mental, emotional things that act that way, but still we as human beings try to control it ourselves, gather it and hoard it and control it for ourselves. But, man, how much better off are we when we really do live this more radical, and I know it's a charged word, but live this more radical disciple life where we trust God for what comes next. I'm not saying you got to empty your bank account every Friday and trust that God will provide for you next week. But what if we did have a more open hand about just everything in life, our time, our money, our whatever, everything about our life. Just we're more open-handed with it, knowing that God was going to take care of tomorrow. He tells us to do that, and that's a New Testament thing just as much as an Old. But it's so hard for us humans to do that. We like to store that extra jar of manna under the bed because, God parted the Red Sea, and He turned bitter water into clean water, but if I don't have food to feed my babies in the morning, That's a scary thought. It's a scary thought. But yet God does provide. And that's the thing. It's letting go and trusting God to provide for tomorrow. And in this case, for the Israelites, He did. And speaking to all these tests we've been talking about in the building of character and faith, absolutely, this says this. If you live this way for months on end, eventually it might even become a bit of might take it for granted. Like, yeah, there'll be manna in the morning. God's going to take care of us. But they're forced into this rhythm of trusting God for their daily bread. Yes.
Well, and we talked about God treating them like adolescents a little bit.
Yeah.
And he gets frustrated with them because he says, don't keep any overnight, and they keep it overnight, and then don't go out on the Sabbath, and they go out. But eventually, 40 years the manna arrived, they would have gotten into a really good Sabbath habit of manna doesn't show up on the Sabbath. We don't go out on the Sabbath.
That's true. So even this practice over time not only does it build that, but it also is slowly training them to live a Sabbath life when they are farming for themselves and living a more normal life. Yeah, I like that. That's good. And I'm going to talk about that Sabbath point here in another second.
I don't want to precede you, so if you're
No, go for it.
If you're going to go after this, stop it.
Okay.
But the idea of daily manna and depending on God every day and not gathering in advance, I think is a great lesson. Our walk with God has to be dependence every day. We can't store it up. I mean, you might think, well, I'm going to pray 3 hours, so I don't have to pray for the rest of the month. It doesn't work that way. Every day, we're told to be filled with the Spirit, and in the Greek it's present tense, keep on being filled with the Spirit. Why? Because we leak so badly. And we need to be filled very often. And our dependence on God is we get, our devotionals and things like that, or the edification that Pete talked about, that has to be ongoing. That has to be a regular thing in our lives, just like the gathering of manna was every day.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, in a spiritual sense and for our souls. I like that we leak so badly. We have to keep getting filled up because we leak so badly. That's really good. And Exodus, how well does Exodus speak to that? There rose up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Right? Or how long does it take for these Israelites to cross the Red Sea before they forget God's power? Or how long does it take them to get to Sinai before we read of generations of Israelites that have completely gone astray? Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, I guess that's more of a Deuteronomy, Leviticus thing where he's telling you, hey, teach this to your kids. Have it, wear it on your head, and have it on your signposts and on your doors and on your fences. Yeah, I appreciate that, Sam.
Was it for 40 years that God provided manna in the book?
I would assume so. Through this full 40-year wilderness trek. Yeah.
I bet they got tired of manna in the book.
Yes, I would think so. That they would eventually get kind of sick of it. But it's described as this so miraculously that I always kind of wondered if it just kind of had a, miraculously goodness about it. Like, you would never get tired of it. I don't know.
They ate bread every day. That's what people back then ate.
That's true. I guess they didn't have as much variety in their life.
Manna instead of bread that they grew.
It had a slight sweet taste. It tastes like coriander seed, it said.
Yeah.
No doubt, this is personal opinion. God made it that so that those who like a tart taste, they could cook it and prepare it so that they would be happy with it. And those like me who like it like it is, I could eat it for 40 years every day without any problem whatsoever.
That's interesting that I've never had anybody dive into the culinary aspects of it, that it might provide a variety of tastes and flavors depending on how you cook it, and that's interesting. No? Yes.
I think it's funny, you have the times leaders come in and don't do what they're supposed to.
Yeah.
This time it's like they're tattling on them. In 22,
22.
they come and say, they gathered more than they're supposed to. Because it would arrive the right amount. And yet, okay, they've got 2 now, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do about this.
Right.
No, that's the way it's supposed to be, and this is what God's doing.
And they report it to
Other times,
Moses.
they just let them do what they're supposed to. You're not supposed to, and they don't try to come to Moses.
Right. That's a good point too. Yeah, the fullness, or excuse me, what's the word? The perfect amount The abundance of it is another awesome point here, that nobody had too little and nobody had too much. And that's the way God provided for them. I don't really know what to do with it, but I think it's beautiful, and I think it speaks about the character of God for a little bit there, or just the miraculousness of the distribution.
Well, Paul used that figure over in 2 Corinthians,
Yeah.
the equality of teaching them to be givers.
The church, to care for each other, make sure nobody was suffering. Yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking. I wasn't sure if I was making that up. There's so many of these things that, like, I'm pretty sure that's there, but I don't want to say it because I'm not positive in this moment. It's not something that made my notes.
Contentment with what they have.
Say it again.
Paul mentions the contentment.
The contentment for what they have, yeah. This is 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, for anybody who wants to look at that later. So the double portion given for the 6th day, for the Sabbath, it once again shows the miraculousness of it. That, hey, if I keep it for myself, the next day it's spoiled and rotten. But on the 6th to the 7th day, it's not. I mean, it just shows God's divine work within it. But I think it's important to see, when they go back out to collect manna on the Sabbath morning, after being taught this by Moses and the Lord, what happens? You said this. Yeah.
But there's nothing there.
There's nothing there, and God gets mad, right?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can find this verse real fast. Goodness, I should have written it down. Anyway, God gets frustrated this time that they go back out, and I guess I want to pause for a second and say, hey, this is not because God is this angry authoritarian that said, hey, I told you not to go back on the Sabbath, and why are you going back out on the Sabbath? And he's angry, or else we've read that 4 other times to this point, okay? That's not, I don't think, God's nature here, and I don't think that's God's motivation for the anger here. I think the motivation for God getting angry about this scenario is that they are resisting that good life they're trying to lead them towards. To tie in this morning's sermon, which, like I said, this was class for last week, so it worked out well. To tie in this morning's sermon, the Sabbath is meant for man. It's to bless them. It is to be good for them. It is to give them a time for reflection on God that will just increase the goodness of their life. It's to give their hands a break, to give the land a break. It is good. It is of God. And here they are trying to go out there to labor. I don't know how much labor gathering manna was, but here they are trying to go out and do this again. And so when God, this extra step that we see here, I think it is not God being an angry authoritarian who has been disobeyed. It's God, it's almost like a frustrated parent, like, why don't you want to enjoy the Sabbath, to take this day that I've given you to live the good life I'm trying to lead you into? That's my thoughts on that. Yes?
Why don't you listen?
Yeah, why don't you listen? Why don't you listen to me? I want good things for you. I want you to be happy. The Sabbath would bless you. Why don't you listen? Yeah. All right. It's interesting to think of when they learned the Sabbath. This is potentially when they were taught about the Sabbath for the first time. And to kind of give a more applicable point to all this, at what point, this is just the little note I made for myself, at what point does pragmatism become defiance? All right, we were talking about, like I think I put quotes on it, radical discipleship, where we really do trust in God to provide. So at what point does being pragmatic about our stuff become defiance against trusting in God, or maybe defiance isn't the best word, but resisting or trusting in ourselves instead of trusting in God? I think we should be responsible, logical people and do things in a certain way that work out. Like I think if I decided to, like I said, empty out my bank account tomorrow, that would not be being a very good steward for my children that God has given me and stuff like that, right? But at what point am I hoarding that kind of stuff up for myself? And that's one very specific example. I don't want to focus on money specifically for that. But at what point does me being practical, logical, add up to where, I'm trusting myself instead of God? Let's go Tyler and then Pete.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with really where your heart is.
Yeah.
And just kind of when you're leaning on yourself, you're not really leaning on God anymore, and that's where you're going wrong. When you're leaning in God, then maybe that's not necessarily, that's not bad.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That a lot of times it's the intentions of the heart. Am I doing this because I'm fearful? I'm doing this because I want my own security and I want all this? Or am I doing it just to be a good steward, and I can trust in God beyond that. I think that's a good. I mean, I think the intention of the heart is actually a good root answer for almost all of these kind of questions, especially too.
I might be reading more into this than that's really there.
Sure.
You know, the beginning of chapter 16, it gives a date of when this happened. It's only a month after they've crossed the Red Sea, right?
Yeah.
So they crossed the Red Sea with all these flocks, and it's only been a month, and they're grumbling about being hungry, right? So obviously something was going on here, and perhaps it was that certain people had control of those flocks, and they weren't sharing it with anybody else.
That's interesting.
The flocks were their bank account on the hook.
All right.
So they didn't want to cash that in.
or that,
Sure.
right? It's, hey, we're not going to eat these flocks that God provided us when we left Egypt, because we don't want to dip into our bank account.
Right.
So let's grumble instead.
Yeah, and see if anything will happen.
And I think that's a good example of what you're talking about. Is God gave them all they needed. They didn't need to give them a manna. They had all these flocks.
Yeah.
But they were like, well, I'm going to trust in God. I want to keep these flocks for
Right.
myself.
God gave this to me. He doesn't want me to use it for this. Like, I need God to give me something else.
But
you know?
yeah, and we can do the same thing. You know?
Yeah.
If we aren't generous and we hoard, what God's given us, we're
Right.
doing the same thing.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's actually, I like that a lot, Pete. Thank you.
Hebrews ties this to the Sabbath in a slightly different way.
Okay.
It's the very end of 3, and then I'll read into 4. Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt, and with whom he was angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declare an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his work. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a calling day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So there we've tied the physical seventh-day Sabbath to the resting God's by being obedient to God.
Yeah.
In the New Testament.
Right.
And that's why Hebrews goes all the way back to that original story to make the connection.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. Yeah, that the rest here that he's striving them to have is a fuller, more divine rest in the end, that is connected. I agree.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to your question that you.
Yeah.
I think it's such a good question. When does being practical become not trusting God?
And our example was with money a lot, but I don't think it has to be money. It can even be like, what point am I not trusting in God because I don't want to go pull off on the side of the road and help this person because they could rob me? Is that practicality or is that unfaithfulness?
I struggle with it too, and I think it's a good point. But I think he hit on it real good, and I couldn't hear too well, so I don't know everything he said. But it seems to me from the whole Bible and the New Testament that one of the indications that we trust God is that we're generous. And if we quit being generous, that's probably a little red flag that we're trying to trust ourselves. We're saying, well, God's not going to provide for me. I better do this myself.
Yeah.
And so generosity can be one of the, being proper stewards of what we do have and being willing to give can be one of the indicators maybe we're not trusting
That's a good
God.
point.
And we've left the practical, and it is practical that we be good stewards of our money with our families and with our futures and things like that, retirement, things like that. But when does we show that we're not trusting God? When we quit being generous, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a great like staple to put on that. Is generosity, intentions of the heart, generosity. Yeah.
But we do have a reminder in the New Testament to not just live off of other people's generosity, that we are called to still work.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing here. I think this is the combination. Not that I have a great answer to that question. That's the question I'd like for you to take home, reflect on, engage in your everyday life. Is, hey, am I just being a good steward? Am I being wise? Am I being practical? Or am I having doubts about God's ability here? You know, am I being wise in choosing this, or am I being fearful? That's a better word. Fearful here. And so a lot of this, I think, is the idea that we step forward and we expect God, we walk forward expectantly. That we say, yeah, I'm going to try to be wise here, but I'm also going to be generous. You know, I'm going to stop for this guy on the side of the road, but I'm going to keep myself on my way. You know what I mean? I think that, yeah, the intentions of the heart, the generosity is a balance of these two things. And really, this leads really well into our second point, which I'm going to skip reading. But the next story, it can be glossed over as another water story here. Oh, it's another place where they're thirsty, they don't have water, God provides. So there's something very interesting about this one specifically. I guess I will read the last 2 or 3 verses, 5, 6, and 7 of 17. The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock of Horeb, strike the rock, and water will come out for its people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel. In verse 7, "And he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" And this, I think, ties in very well to our last point. There's something interesting about this one. I was really going to skip over. I'm like, for time, because we only have 5 more minutes. But I was like, no, we gotta touch on this testing of the Lord. What does it mean to test the Lord? And that last little bit is it. For they said, they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" I think that's so intriguing. That they're trying to force his hand. They're putting God to the proof.
Yeah.
They're putting God to the proof, trying to force his hand. Hey, we're thirsty. Is the Lord among us or not? Trying to manipulate and work God into doing what they want for their own will and for their own desires. And so I think this conversation we've just been having can do that as well. Like, I can get in my car and say, "I'm not going to buckle my seatbelt because I live in faith." And like that conversation of, is it practicality or is it a fearfulness, right? Doing that would be to put God to the test, to say, "Oh, God will take care of me," like, because he's God, and is God among me or not? I'm not going to buckle and I'll be fine. Like, and there's so many applications to that right there.
That's how the devil tempted Jesus. Throw yourself off this mountain, he'll take care of you.
Yeah, doesn't the scripture say God will take care of you? Yeah.
And he says, "You should not, it's written, you'll not test the Lord your
You know,
God."
put God to the test. Exactly.
Have you heard the story about God taking care of you? The flood came, the guy finally climbed on his house.
Yes.
I sent you a boat and a helicopter. What more did you want?
Right. He's like, I can't. I won't get on the boat. I can't get on the helicopter. God's going to save me. God's going to save me. I said, "Well, God, you didn't save me. I sent you a boat and a helicopter." Yeah. And so while we're saying, hey, we want to live in faith, and we want to live in faith and not worry so much about packing that extra box of manna under the bed. We're going to live in faith and trusting God to provide, while also being wise. The opposite of this is not to go into a place where we put God to the test, saying, "Oh, I'm not going to worry about anything because God is there and He'll do it for me." That's trying to manipulate God, and it's the other side of this.
I worked with a guy whose son was in college, and they were he was going to go and like under the bridge and care for these people, like in the evenings or whatever. And his dad was like, "That's not smart. You shouldn't do that. It's dangerous down there." And he's like, "Well, how else are they going to learn about Jesus and everything?" And he's like, he goes, "And I'm not scared." And he goes, but you could get killed. And he goes, well, I'm not afraid to die. So that's not testing God, but it's just like,
No, I think that's
it's just like, and then what does a father say to that? Well, okay, I mean.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I think that is a great example, a great story to illustrate that point of, do I balance practicality with faith? And saying, oh, is it the most practical, logistical, wise thing in the world to go into a place where it's potentially dangerous? No. But I have faith. That's not being dumb. That's not putting God to the test. But it is also stepping out of faith. And I think that's a beautiful example of that. And what a wonderful ministry.
Makes me think about our conversation earlier about things being kept in context.
Yes.
The Israelites all came from Jacob. Jacob being given the name Israel, the name Israel meaning he wrestles with God.
Yes.
Part of that is he who wrestles with God. So during this entire 40 years, these guys are going to wrestle with God the entire time.
Oh, yeah.
And in 32, God calls them a stiff-necked people. So the thing about a stiff-necked people is you've got to continually turn their head before their head focuses on you.
Yeah.
Before they turn away again.
Yeah.
So for 40 years, he's got to provide for the very basic needs. And in this context, I mean, he's continuously turning their head,
It's a twist.
turning their neck.
It's a twist, yeah.
No, look here, here,
Yeah.
and it's just a 40 years worth of.
Right. Pulling it back. Making that neck loosen up. And yeah, I like that. It's kind of on a spring. Like if you go into my office and take one of my 40 bobbleheads, okay? You turn it this way and you let go, where'd it go? But if you did it, imagine, if you did it for 40 years, it's going to face the way you want it to face. Yeah, I appreciate that. Wrestling with God, it's a half Nelson to get it facing the way you want it, right? Yeah, I thought you'd enjoy that. I wrestled in 7th grade. Okay, we're in the final minutes, and I can't go over this next week because then I'd be 2 weeks behind. I'm not allowed to be 2 weeks behind. I'm only allowed to be 1 week behind. The next we see actually wrote like a 15-page paper over the next story. It's the Amalekites attacking Israel. It's their first real battle. They've been slaves. They've not been taught how to fight. You don't teach your slaves how to fight. They're being attacked. In Deuteronomy 25, we're told that they attacked them from the back. Who's in the back? The sick, the women, and the children. Those are the stragglers, okay? And they're attacking the most vulnerable. Kind of shows the extra wickedness of the Amalekites here. But God goes and he, once again, in this test, provides for them. You get Moses going up to the hill. This is the story you recognize him holding up his arms. While his arms are up, they're winning. When his arms go down, they're losing. Why? Because they're magical hands? Because this is a prayer stance, and if he wasn't praying, it wouldn't work? No, it's because it was a visual reminder that God was with him and God was winning the battle. And against all odds, they win because God was with them. They could see that there with Moses. I don't have time for this, but it's really interesting. Some of the early church fathers take that point and illustrate it as Jesus on the hill with the 2 soldiers, the 2 thieves next to him. I don't know why. I don't know what that does for us. I don't really think that's what Moses is trying to get to here. But I can't get that out of my head for some reason. And then we see Joshua for the first time, and the fact that God, his covenant with his people includes a judgment against their enemies. And that's for us too. Now, as much as some people would like to make it this way, our enemies are not of flesh and blood. Okay? They are not of flesh and blood. They are of the Spirit. It is with the devil. It's Ephesians 6. And so we, as God's people, understand that God is fighting alongside us against those evil spiritual forces. And I really don't think we should be attributing that to other people, groups made in the image of God, at least for this conversation. In chapter 18, we get Jethro. He comes back and sees Moses. Moses tells him about what happens. You know what happens? Jethro goes and praises God. And I think it's beautiful because it's finally a culmination of what we've been reading about so many times. Why did God do all that he did through Exodus? To free his people and so the world would know that he alone is God. How many times did we read that? Right? And here, Moses gets to talk to his father-in-law, and he tells him what happens. And what happens? Jethro goes praising God. It's a fulfillment of that goal that has been happening for 20 chapters. And I hate the way to rush through it, but that's the case. And then Jethro says, Moses, what are you doing trying to deal with every problem in Israel? Get some smart people to delegate the judge, being the judges of things, and you just deal with the big hitters. And Moses says, okay, that's a good idea. And it just kind of shows us that the will of God can be mediated through human beings.
very quickly.
Yes.
I don't think we can skip this Aaron and her holding up the hands
Yeah.
of Moses. It's a real good illustration of holding each other's
Each other
hands
up.
in
Yeah.
church work, and we need to support one another and hold up each other's hands as we're fighting against sin and Satan.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. That's the good application. Maybe that's what the church fathers do. No, they do something with Jesus, but I don't know what. But I like that one better. You know, who needs Tertullian? We got Alexander better.
There's also you have to do something. God will provide, but He expects you to do something too.
Yeah, and it ties into one of our previous points. It's moving forward expectingly. God used Moses. God
He had to hold
uses
his hands up. He had
her
to
and
do something
Aaron.
to be winning.
Yeah, exactly. All right, our kids will be coming. Let us pray. Father God, we are so grateful to you. Lord, we know that there are tests in this life. We know that there are difficult times, that some are temptations of Satan and some are tests of you. We ask that you would give us the wisdom to discern which are which. But regardless, let us please come out the other side faithful and better focused on you, that we would see your power and wisdom in the good and the bad, and that we would grow and be strengthened through each and every circumstance and each and every day. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you, guys. I guess I should have spent 3 minutes making jokes at the beginning, and we could have not had to rush through some of that.